Good afternoon, DEC members, and a special welcome to students from Schoolcraft College and AGBU Manoogian High School. I'm Steve Grigorian, CEO of the Detroit Economic. I do want to take a quick moment to thank all of our terrific corporate sponsors who continue to support the DEC so we can bring you a program like today's. Our guest is a hometown success story who grew up in Pontiac, Michigan. Larry Bacow is the 29th president of Harvard University, where he has worked since 2011. Before joining Harvard, Larry was the president of Tufts University from 2001 to 2011, and prior to that spent 24 years in faculty and leadership roles at MIT. President Bacow, we appreciate your time with us today and welcome home.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's nice to be back in Detroit, if only virtually.
Great to have you. So we've got a lot of stuff to cover in a short amount of time. Let's start close to home.
Okay.
Collaborating with Pontiac, Detroit, and Michigan universities are important to you in your role. Tell us why, and can you give us some examples?
Well, so the why is actually pretty easy. I still have deep ties to Michigan. I've got family back there, but also, I got my start in Pontiac. Pontiac has fallen on hard times, as we all know. Detroit, fell on very hard times. As I'm pleased to see is starting to come back, and it's a way of trying to give back a bit. But also, there's tremendous talent in the state of Michigan, and Michigan is blessed with a wonderful public university system. So it's a privilege to be able to collaborate with our peers. And we have a partnership going with the University of Michigan. My colleague Mark Schlissel and I got together to try and find ways that we could work towards mutual interest in a number of areas that were important both to the state of Michigan and the state of Massachusetts and to the country more broadly. So we're collaborating on opioid addiction. We're collaborating on what we can do to promote economic and social mobility among all of our residents. I think there are lots of other ways that there are natural collaborations. I'm also pleased to say that I know the new president of Michigan State, Sam Stanley. He's a wonderful guy. I think both Michigan and Michigan State are now blessed to be led by people who are both physicians and both life scientists at a time in which it's never been more important as we confront some of the challenges of the coronavirus. And of course, as you know, the great president of Wayne State is also an alumnus. So I think there's much that we can do together, and looking forward to doing more.
Terrific. So universities can, and they are, playing a special role in moments like we live in today with the pandemic, with research and ground level response. How is higher ed, including Harvard, responding to the pandemic?
Well, I would tell you right now that as a nation, we actually face three crises. And I think universities are playing important roles in all three. And Harvard's trying to do its share, but we're not the only one. I think the three crises are the pandemic, the financial crisis, and of course, what we see right now with just the terrible killing of George Floyd and the emotion that's brought out, and how I think it is refocused attention appropriately so on the least fortunate in our society, but particularly the concerns and the of our African American friends and colleagues, and just the scourge of racism more broadly. And I think universities have something to contribute to each one of those. So I think that our research universities, the Michigans, the Michigan States, the Wayne States, the Harvards of the world, have actually never been more important. Because if we're going to find a solution to the problems that are posed by the coronavirus, by COVID, it's going to come from the research that's being done on our campuses. And we're all working, really, really hard right now. President Stanley, hosted actually a webinar for other university presidents focused on advances that we're making in testing, for this disease. So we're all working on rapid diagnostics. We're working on treatment therapies. We're working on vaccines. I'm proud of the fact that the two first vaccines that have gone into human trials came out of Harvard laboratories. So we're working on that. We're also working on how do we restart our economies? How do we deal with this financial crisis that we're facing? And here we've got a terrific program that's project between faculty members in our economics department and faculty members in our epidemiology department at our School of Public Health. And they're trying to identify what are the optimal paths towards reopening, optimal both in terms of helping to accelerate our economic activity while minimizing the risk that we're going to have another breakout, if you will, of COVID. And then I think, our scholars have much to say to inform this discussion about how do we come together again as a nation? How do we address the scourge of racism? What are the long-term corrosive impacts of this on young people? What can we do to address deep-seated problems of inequality in our country? And here we're all, I think, we have intellectual resources. We're focused on what we can do there as well. So I think we have a lot to contribute.
Let's talk about a couple things you had personal experience with recently, and it ties into other universities. In mid-March, you and the presidents of Stanford and MIT wrote an op-ed which was published in the New York Times urging people to get ahead of the coronavirus. Tell us a little bit about that collaboration and why you decided to do that.
So Harvard was actually the second university in the country to announce that we were going to send our students home. University of Washington was the first, and they had already had a breakout on their campus. And like many others, we were following this virus since it became obvious in China in January, in part because we have a lot of students who come from China. We have faculty who go back and forth, and we were worried about the infection. When we did that, we were followed very closely by MIT and then by Stanford. And at the time, all of us were accused of acting prematurely. But we all had the benefit of access to some of the best minds available in epidemiology and infectious disease and virology and public health. And so we published that op-ed piece as a call to others to act and to act quickly, because I think it was obvious to us that if we failed to do so, we would face serious risks to human health. And I'm sorry to say we've been born, in retrospect, we were right. I wish we had been wrong. But I think had this nation been a little bit quicker to respond, as many in academia did, then we would not have, over 100,000 dead in this country already today.
You had a very personal experience with COVID-19 that you went public with, and that was in late March. You and your wife contracted the coronavirus. We're certainly very happy you both survived. How has that experience shaped any decisions you've made as Harvard's president?
Well, we were actually among the first to contract the virus at Harvard. I think, we may have been the 12th or 13th, somewhere in that vicinity. There are 40,000 people on our campus, between students, faculty, and staff. And we were very public about the fact that we had contracted it because we wanted people to understand that anybody is susceptible to this disease, and that people should take the requirement to engage in social distancing quite seriously. And I think we were fortunate that we didn't suffer the severe respiratory problems that hospitalized many and caused some people their lives. So for us, it was a bad case of the flu. Not anything I'd wish on anybody, but it was not life-threatening. We were quite lucky. But I do think that it helped me understand in a deep and personal way the fact that all of us are at risk for this. And it has shaped, I think, how I look at how quickly we want to reopen and how we respond as an institution, both in terms of our scholarship, but also how we think about the plans to resume normal activity. And don't get me wrong, we want students back on our campus as quickly as we can possibly get them, but we want to do it in a manner that I think respects the very real challenges that we all face as from a public health perspective. And here again, I want to give a shout out to President Schlissel, for Mark wrote a pretty candid piece, on this topic about what we can expect and what we can't, and what we're going to need to do. And I think it was, absolutely the right thing to do.
Well, he's a very valued Detroit Economic Club board member, and I believe he was scheduled to be on this call. So thank you to Dr. Schlissel. So you mentioned something that you were one of the first universities to shut down. Certainly on everyone's mind today is the reopening of universities and what will a student experience be like when you do open. So can you give us your thoughts on reopening Harvard and what that might look like?
Well, I suspect, look, every university is in a slightly different position. The Ivy League presidents have been meeting every 2 weeks to discuss our plans and how we're all thinking about it. One of the interesting things that's become apparent is that those of us who lead urban campuses are in a very different position than those who don't. So Columbia, Penn, and Harvard are in a very different position than Cornell and Dartmouth and Princeton, and even Brown, which is sort of in between. Why? Because our faculty and staff, certainly a lot of the staff, arrive by public transit every single day. And so their exposure and to potential pathogens look very, very different from people who just go from their house and get in a car and drive to work. And so we need to consider their safety, but also what's the status of the virus at the time at which we reopen. So each school is in a slightly different position. I will tell you, though, that I think on almost every campus, it's going to be a different experience for college students, no matter when they come back. We are probably all going to be masked on campus. There'll be substantial social distancing on campus. I don't expect students are going to be crowding into dining halls together. In fact, at least initially, it wouldn't surprise me if what we all wind up doing is grab and go eating, where students pick up their stuff and bring it back to their room. Or we'll schedule time in the dining halls. You're going to eat between 5:30 and 6, and you're going to come between 6 and 6:30 to spread people out. There's actually going to be a lot of distance learning that will take place on our campuses, even for students who are physically on campus. It's going to be impossible to have big lectures. We're going to have to do that remotely, like this. Lots of students will not be able to get back to campus. All of our campuses have a lot of international students. The United States is not processing F1 visas at the moment. So those people aren't going to be able to get here. We're going to have to teach them remotely. I think it's, Mark had something to say about this, but, we'll see where we are in terms of athletics in the fall. I doubt you're going to see 110,000 people in the big house anytime soon, or 80,000 people at State or whatever. So it's going to be different. I think students are not going to have the same kind of social experiences that they're used to, because we're going to have to keep people distant if we're going to keep people safe. So it will be a different experience. I think all of us are working really, really hard to ensure that the quality of the educational experience is still quite high. In this past March, when we all pivoted to online education, we really did that in a very, very short period of time. And in effect, we just took what we were doing and put it on Zoom. But now we are designing courses from scratch to be taught online, taking advantage of the opportunities that they present. So I think it'll be a different experience for students, a better experience for students, even if they are in residence on campus for some of those courses while they're taking them.
Before we get to audience questions, Larry, I wanted to talk about the higher ed industry in general and its financial health. Can you talk about the economic impact of this crisis on higher ed in general, and then specifically Harvard?
Well, I'll start with a conversation about Harvard. We estimate that the impact just this fiscal year, and our fiscal year ends at the end of this month. So from March, through June, is about $415 million before management actions, okay? And we estimate the potential fiscal impact next fiscal year to be about $715 million from what our prior budget was. That's off of a $5.5 billion base. So it's quite substantial. So where does that come from? It comes from an increase in the demand for financial aid. We guarantee to meet the needs of all students. And we had students who never applied for financial aid who are going to need it because their parents have lost their job. This past semester, it came from rebate of room and board fees. It's come from a decline in gifts for current use, which inevitably happens during a recession. In Harvard's case, we lost all of our executive education. We do a huge amount of executive education at Harvard. And that all went to zero because people couldn't travel and businesses stopped sending people, to places like ours for executive education. We're watching the markets, but we're assuming that there's going to be some decline in the endowment draw for this year as well. So you add it all up, it's a big impact. I think it's going to be a substantial impact for higher education writ large. The bulk of students who get educated in this country get educated at public universities, public colleges, public universities. Michigan is blessed with one of the great public university systems in the country, among the very, very best. And everybody in the state knows what happened in the financial crisis of 2008. The state cut back its support for public institutions. The presidents in charge at that time had no choice but to pass on many of those increased costs, to students and their families through higher tuition bills. The university expenditures did not go up. In fact, they took out a whole bunch of expenditures and cut way back. But because the cost of an education got shifted from the taxpayer to students and their families, tuitions went up. Now I'm worried what's going to happen this time around because the states are seeing, I don't have to tell you, a huge decline in their tax revenues. And the state budgets are going to be under tremendous pressure. And when that happens, we're going to see cuts to higher education again. And then there's some small, private colleges which are heavily tuition dependent who are going to be facing, I think, some existential threats as well. So I think these are going to be challenging times.
I wanted to shift to some audience questions, and there's actually a perfect one that came in from Denise, and it sort of dovetails what we've been talking about with higher ed finances. Specifically, how does a university endowment get utilized during a time like this, and have you had to access Harvard's endowment?
Well, we access Harvard's endowment all the time. In fact, the largest single revenue source that we have at Harvard is our endowment. It covers 35% of our operating budget. And typically we try and draw about 5% from the endowment each year. And the assumption is that we earn 8% on it, and we have roughly 3% inflation in higher education terms. And so that allows us to spend 5% and maintain the purchasing power of the endowment. We will draw even more heavily on it this year, but ultimately what we need to do is we need to match revenues with expenditures with our revenues, just like every other organization. We can dip for a while, but we can't sustain that over time because we're eating the seed corn when we do that. Also, the endowment is highly restricted in that it actually consists of 13,000 at Harvard separate accounts where people have donated money for a specific purpose. And we can't really take money and move it over here to help do something else. So it's not as if it's a big bank account that's fungible and we can just spend it down. It's been assembled over the course of our history, 384 years, and we have a moral obligation to make sure that it's preserved to support future generations and that we just don't spend it ourselves.
Thank you. DEC member Dave, you talked a bit about switching to virtual classrooms, but Dave wants to know, do we think remote learning is here to stay? And if so, how do elite universities like yourselves and some of ours in our state adapt? And what's that do to their value proposition?
So I think we've just done a real-time experiment in which we sort of forced literally everybody to get comfortable with this technology, right? And for some purposes, it works pretty well. I suspect it's working, I hope it's working pretty well today. And I think it's only going to get better over time as people now start to understand what it can do, but also what it can't do. And I think one of the reasons that you see so much pressure on colleges and universities to reopen is that students now really understand the value of the residential college experience, and they all long for that. So I think it's here to stay. We'll continue to use it. It opens up lots of opportunities for us to engage people who don't have the time to come back to college, adult learners, people at a distance who would like to get the kind of an education, the quality of an education one can get at Wayne State or Michigan State or Eastern or Central, or in Ann Arbor. So I think all of us will be looking for ways to use these technologies to reach and engage a broader base of learners going forward, but also to just do a better job of teaching our students now.
Derek in the chat box asked two questions. What do you expect the impact of COVID to be on admissions and enrollment? And then in addition, do you have any thoughts on standardized testing, SAT and ACT?
So on admissions and enrollment, it's a great question, Derek. And I can give you a very, very precise answer. It's just you're gonna have to wait until September for me to give it to you. I don't have a crystal ball. We'll wait and see. I think it's gonna affect different institutions differently. But I will tell you that I think that if schools need to be online, or if quality of the experience, even for students who are on campus, is such that it's a little, it's not what students expect. I think traditional students, right now they may say, well, maybe I'll take a gap year, or maybe I'll take a year off. But students who traditionally do that, take the gap year or a year off, either to travel or do public service or to get a good job or an internship. And chances are there aren't going to be a lot of those opportunities around. So I think once they look at that, they may conclude it's best to just start their education anyway. And it may start online, but hopefully they'll get back on campus pretty quickly. So we'll see what happens with enrollment. And the second half of the question was?
SAT and ACT.
Yes. So there's lots of debate about standardized testing. I would tell you that it's not perfect information, it's noisy information, but it's still valuable information. And at a place like Harvard, it's actually one of the better predictors we have of performance. And what people don't understand is that it often helps students who, at a place like ours, for people who are applying from a place like ours, if they're applying from a high school where very, very few students have ever come from that high school to come to a place like Harvard. Because every high school every year has a valedictorian and a salutatorian. But the people who score very, very well, that's helpful. It's noisy information. We're actually pretty good at being able to calibrate it and see, who's had the benefit of, tutoring and other things versus which students have probably gone and taken this test for the first time, cold. So we can calibrate that.
Well, Larry, one of the things of Detroit Economic Club meetings is we start on time and end on time. So we're approaching the end time. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. I know that it's extremely busy time, and good luck with your planning for the next few months. I want to thank you, thank your team, Amy and Paul as well. Thank my team. To DEC members, just two important points. You will get a survey on this. Again, we're kind of moving into this virtual world of DEC events. We've done 3 or 4 of those now, but we want to continue to get better. So it will take you just 1 minute, please. We do look at the results of that because we want to improve. And last thing to DEC members, please take advantage of tons of virtual events that we have in June. check out our website. I think we've got something there for everybody. So Larry, once again, thank you so much. I know we were excited to talk with you, and hopefully we can see you sometime in person when it's safe to do so.
Well, thanks, Steve, for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk. And to all the members of the DEC, I still have a soft spot in my heart for Detroit, for Southeastern Michigan. And I think for those of you who are creating jobs and opportunity, for fellow Detroiters, thank you for the good work that you're all doing. It's never been more important.
Terrific. And with that, we will say goodbye, stay healthy, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you all.
Look forward to it. Thank you.